Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much, Manera. I'm so glad to be here and to be talking with you today.
Great. I'm looking forward for
Mm,
an interesting conversation. So our first
Yeah,
question is, we have a lot about the educators' efforts to ensure student success since the beginning of this pandemic. However, many educators themselves are encountering challenges to achieve their goals of helping students, such as shifting classes virtually, changes in guidelines and regulation for reopening. As an educator, what are some of the main challenges you encounter since this pandemic started?
yeah. There's been several actually. I think the first one, as we look to deliver the best service, keep our students safe, keep our staff safe. You have to search internally and maintain your own personal and mental well-being through this pandemic. If we think about everything that's going on, all of the uncertainty that still remains with COVID-19, other things that we've seen since this quarantine with social injustice, what our political climate is, there's just so much uncertainty right now. So when thinking about the role as an educator, this is the place that I start. And just knowing that this is a big challenge. The other thing is that when you really look into what education is and what it's been for so long, remote learning, the potential for hybrid learning is brand new for all educators and for all learners. We are all learning as we go and we're innovating. So it's a very exciting time, but it's also just so challenging because everything that we've built our foundation on has been shifted and it's not the same at all. So when you think about communicating that to families and students and retraining teachers and retraining educators, matching the necessary health and safety guidelines, it's a big undertaking, and it's also happening in a short window of time because we have this urgency to get back into schools and to make learning as routine as it has been all along, while it's actually very new territory. And then the last thing, which is a very big extension on what I was just talking about, is just managing the competing expectations that are taking place. I think that everyone expects education to run smoothly just because for the most part, we've been running on the same format for years and we've just kind of extended it along the way. But at this point, we have to adequately support what family needs. Many families are struggling to adjust to this technology push. They are now the leaders of their children's education, especially if it's remote only. And they have to now teach their children, manage their children, monitor their children's time, watch over their children's assignments. And they may not be receiving the type of support they expect, want, or need at this point. At the same time, many students aren't used to working from home at this rate, unless they were homeschooled prior to this. So, managing their own time, understanding how to get into the platforms they need to, these are all challenges. Meanwhile, on the staff side, obviously safety is very important. But for a lot of staff, this is new technology as well. So they're learning how to manage this while also managing how they should express it and explain it to families and students. So, at this point, we're all learning as we go. And it's just so different, and these are things that we all have to consider when trying to provide education that makes sense.
I totally agree with you. It's a pretty challenging, even not for, elementary, high school students. It's also challenging for higher ed. Like when you're talking about even like master or PhD students, we struggle with learning distance, even though we try to enforce it in our system for years.
Yeah.
So there are many disadvantages we already covered of distant learning, and notice our lack of preparations to shift to everything virtually. Yet we understand that there is a risk of coming back to schools during this pandemic, especially with the coming flu season. As many schools in the Rochester area are ready to welcome students back to school, what do you think are the main concerns for students, parents, and educators?
This is a big one here. there's a lot of conversations that go on. As a director of operations, regionally, we talk amongst each other. We also talk amongst other directors of operation across, I'd say New York State at the minimum, sometimes stretch into New Jersey, Massachusetts, Boston as well as other principals. And clearly the safety concern is the biggest one. Everything from as students come in now, just making sure they have the proper air filtration, making sure that items are properly sanitized, making sure that staff feel supported and safe as well, because they'll be taking the brunt of time with students. And we also want families to have a peace of mind. As we think about flu season coming up specifically, and knowing that whatever we know about COVID right now, we haven't escaped it just yet. The concern is, if we're going back to school, which a lot of schools are, my school is going back shortly in the next few weeks. How can we effectively manage and monitor and be prepared to reclose when the time comes? I think the biggest concern is that we can close in a way that minimizes student, family, and staff impact. So if that means turning students away at the appropriate times based on the COVID symptoms, or at this point, the COVID and flu symptoms will overlap. They do overlap. They also overlap with the symptoms of the common cold. So being very diligent in terms of monitoring all students, staff, vendors, whomever comes into the building, to mitigate the risk of an outbreak in our school is the first thing. And just being adequately prepared to reclose, not wanting to draw this out in a sense of education needs to happen, and it needs to happen in the school, and all of the traditional talk that's been taking place, which I do understand, but we're erring on the side of safety. So we want to make sure that we can close in a way that does not risk anyone of a major outbreak, risk their long-term health, and is as swift as possible. If that's even before another state mandate, I would be fine with that happening if it meant the safety of our building.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think it's also trying to make a balance between bringing kids back to school and take them from that virtual reality. And in case something happened, then they have to go back to, that digital learning. And this is bringing the question that it's been lately, rising up is, are we ready to use AI in our education? Since the rise of AI, there are many claims that education sooner or later is going to be digitalized. Some argue this pandemic is probably a test to see if this would work for us to enter the new era. And should we continue in investing in AI research and digitalized education? What's your thoughts about these claims, and what's your vision of education after this pandemic?
That's a great question. I think in terms of the AI specifically, it's interesting because I got my master's in informatics from the School of Communication. And one of the big things at the time was studying the various forms of how artificial intelligence can benefit various walks of life. I think at the time I was focused on collegiate sports performance or something like that. But I just came across so many different disciplines within that field, and it was just so interesting to me. One of the things I think of with a school like ours, which is a great school, focuses on academic rigor, promotes the transition from students going from high school into college and being prepared along the way from K through 12. We currently don't, in regard to technology and AI specifically, provide the foundation that would be necessary to get to college, if that makes sense. So in terms of academic content, literacy, math, we are, we would consider ourselves where we need to be. We think that we are some leaders in the area and in the region with performance, especially in regard to the transition of urban education. But when we talk about what would be necessary in terms of getting our students college ready, the type of platforms that they need to access, even now. And now we know that because of the changes that have happened, those requirements will more than likely change for higher education. So we need to do a much better job of building our students up from pre-K to 12 in terms of the technology that they're using, as well as the familiarity that their families have. Because at this point, this is a clear demonstration of the haves and the have-nots right now. So I think that specifically with my role in urban education, I've been talking to our leadership about how we can better bridge that gap and make sure that those resources are available. Because if you look at the way that things are, the artificial intelligence side, I think should grow, because if something like this were to happen again and there's other uncertainties that could be risked, right? War at this rate is doesn't sound like an anomaly, something that could happen. Yeah. If we want education to continue, we should do that in any way possible. And I think that technology will be a means to an end for us. The other piece of your question was about the vision for after the pandemic. Mm-hmm. I've long thought about this, and I think that we have a great opportunity to provide more customized support for students and families based on what their preferred learning styles are, what their preferred home experiences are. Mainstream education has been so one way for so many years. It's basically oral classroom instruction provided for a large group of students at a time, lends itself to auditory learners more so than anyone else. We focus on lecture, we focus on standardized tests, and this is what K-12 education becomes unless you're homeschooled. And there's a few schools that deviate from that, but that's far and few between in my understanding. Understanding that, education, while it could be free, it could be private, regardless of how it looks, it's always a big business, because there's definitely money involved. When you think about student enrollment, when you think about child nutrition, these are avenues where finances are being shared. Yeah. So I think that if we look at our students and families as large consumers, their preferences should matter. And we should not stick with the one-way model that we have seen over and over again, which means that this hybrid learning opportunity, this remote learning opportunity are things that we should really consider in how we can help our students and families, and maybe even giving them the choices that allow them to make informed decisions that best benefit their living situations. I think that COVID-19 is really exposing that as an opportunity that we have. So if we could increase distance learning and hybrid options, I think that we could really help students and families determine their best fit, and probably even some teachers and staff who are parents or, have different living situations. So that's where I would like to see things go coming out of this pandemic.
I totally agree with you. And I think it's a chance that a lot of people exposed to technology, even probably they never thought they would consider that as an option for education. So I want to thank you for this great conversation. Do you have any final thoughts before we end up this conversation?
I think this is great. I'm just so glad to be a part of it. I would love to engage in further discussions. And obviously I'll be loving to watch the ones that I'm not a part of. So just thank you for having me. And I'm excited.